Hello again, colleagues, and welcome to the next DINCast. This episode is going to be exploring leadership under pressure with Drew Povey. Delighted that Drew's been able to join us today. Drew is a well-recognised author, a leadership coach, and formerly a headmaster of a secondary school as well. Really nice guy to talk to, and he knows a huge amount about leadership and coaching, and I think that's really important in these times. So we're going to have a good conversation about leadership over the next 20 minutes or so. So Drew, thank you so much for agreeing to take part in today's DINCast. Could you just introduce yourself and just tell our viewers a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Great to be on here, Ian. Thanks for the invite. Yeah, my name's Drew Povey. Probably best to understand me by talking about my sports background first. Bizarrely, I started coaching rugby at the age of 15 and just really enjoyed that. And that got my thirst for understanding about leadership and culture, even though I wouldn't have said that as a 15-year-old, of course, when we're too busy drinking White Lightning cider on the park. Really, it was about, I just fell in love with this way of communicating and helping people develop. So then I went into teaching and carried the sport on, and noticed that what teachers did and what coaches did was very similar. Then went in through teaching and went through leadership ranks and saw that what a leader was doing is very similar to what a teacher does with a class of kids, is the same as what a coach was doing. And then started to work in other sectors as well and looked at this thing called leadership. And really, I suppose the bug bit at the age of 15 and hasn't quite left me yet. So that's a little bit about me. I've had a very interesting and varied life. I've had some really good times, and of course, like most people, I've had some real challenging times too. Does that give you enough of a synopsis, Mr. Wright?
It certainly does, Drew, and we'll pick up on some of those points as we go through this. But I mean, when I was looking at your biography, you'd sort of describe yourself as a leadership geek. So what does leadership mean to you?
Yeah, well, I am a leadership geek, I think. I mean, I love leadership and everything about it. I've been referred to as a person who could literally talk a glass eye to sleep when it comes to leadership. But I love it because fundamentally it's about people. Fundamentally it's about influencing people. And that, therefore, is really multifaceted and fascinating. So this idea of leadership, as we've come to understand it more and kind of get behind the eyes of it, I think is the thing that can shift the needle most in businesses, both in good times and of course in a position that we're in now with the COVID crisis, in the bad times too.
So you work with a whole host of different organisations, as you say, from the sporting world to the business world and that. So how well equipped do you think leaders have been to deal with the current crisis?
I would say partly. I think we've always got to try and contextualise crisis anyway. Great book called Winners by Alistair Campbell, chapter 15. I did say I was a geek. He talks about crisis, and he talks about the fact that in the first year of government, when he was involved in it, there were 200 and odd different crises. Well, by definition, not all of those could have been a crisis. So I think we have to weigh up, is it a big problem? Is it a crisis? Where is it on a continuum between spilt milk at a teddy bear's picnic and the Twin Towers? You go, what are we dealing with here? If we do hit crisis times, I think we're pretty good at crisis management. A lot of people at the moment are talking about crisis management. That's a good thing, and that's the kind of stuff we've got to do. That's the operational stuff. I'm not as convinced that we're as good as the crisis leadership, the people element, about how we engage people with this process, particularly with what we're dealing with at the moment. There's people in lots of different status of employment. There's people in lots of different positions. How good are we at that? I'm not quite sure we're perhaps as good as we need to be at the moment, but it's all good learning, Ian.
So one of the key things leaders are leaders for is because of the requirement for them to take decisions. Now, obviously, in a crisis such as we've been in recently, it's probably quite hard to get the balance right between making the decisions that you've got to at speed and making the correct ones. So what advice might you have for leaders who are worried about that scenario?
Well, that's a big question. It really is. It's a huge question. Making decisions is always big. I think the difference between really successful organizations and less successful, and I suppose really successful leaders and less successful leaders, is their ability to think. I think thinking is a really underrated part of what we do. And I know people are going to be listening to this thinking, what I am thinking, what you're suggesting, I'm just making it up. I'm not. But I use a model with people very often, particularly leadership teams, and it's the 3P model, which I think can help us think. Because yes, we do need to do things quickly, but we do need to do things with quality as well. So the 3Ps are, I think, occasionally we need to press pause. Great book on this by Kevin Cashmere, The Pause Principle. Rob Poynton's written a lot about pause. It's good at times just to pause. And even when I work with elite sport and they say to me, Drew, we can't pause, we're in the middle of a game. Well, if you've had a try scored against you or you've had a goal scored against you, you've got about 30 seconds to a minute and a half to take a moment to pause. Once I think you've pressed pause, you've then got to try and zoom out of the situation and get a perspective. What is the big picture? You know, don't just be running on the emotion of the initial position that you're in. Try and draw out. Yes, you've got to use emotion. Emotions are important, but let's use some logic too. And I think once we've pressed pause and we've been able to get that perspective, well, then we can set the priorities in the right way. And I also think a big part of this is talking to people and talking to people and really listening to the answers that they're giving us. And the more information we get as we pause, get perspective and set the priorities, I think the better decisions we can make. But it's always got to have a caveat with it. You know, don't beat yourself up. You've got to make the best decision that you possibly can in the situation you're in this moment. And that, I think, is a really important thing to remember. We're not going to get everything right, you know, and actually, if we did say we were getting everything right, we'd probably be kidding ourselves.
So one of the challenges that organizations and leaders will have is around how they manage performance in a crisis, because there are still roles to be formed, services to sort of deliver and things like that. So do you have any advice for, you know, leaders about how you can identify good and bad performance in a crisis when they're already under a huge amount of pressure?
Yeah, I mean, observation's got to be absolutely crucial. You've got to keep your eyes everywhere, literally eyes in the back of your head. And as you're observing everything that's going on, I think we can sometimes make snap decisions. I think observing and understanding is the critical bit. And if someone has made a mistake, and I say this from an education point of view, from a coaching point of view, from a business point of view, from when I work with the police and the NHS, I genuinely don't know anybody that comes into work and goes, I'm going to make the biggest cock up today possible. You're going to give me a task and I'm going to gleefully make a pig's ear of it. I don't think people do that. Using the great quote from Catherine the Great, I think we have to praise loudly and blame softly during a time like this. But it's about observing and, as Stephen Covey said, seek first to understand. And we've got to understand why someone's done that. And that's where the learning can come in. And we can really springboard people to a higher level of performance if we get that right.
You've talked previously about how important trust in leaders is. And I just wondered, in the present climate, you know, what more could leaders do to maintain and build trust with their teams and their customers, their partners who they work with?
Well, when you go through good times, I think everybody talks about we're a high trust organization, and you know, we know the stats from the Franklin Covey Foundation, high trust organizations outperform low trust by kind of like 280% or something like that. But there's no doubt that when the tough times come, that's when we find out how good the trust is. And these kind of scenarios, I think, can either make a team or break a team. They can either galvanize it or they can create massive gaps within that team. I think it's about working together. Communication has got to be key. You know, we've got to be talking to people as much as possible, even like we're doing today. Putting this communication out there is important. We can still do the face-to-face stuff. I also think we've got to go back to the team stuff from Google, the Project Aristotle stuff, which is around trying to create psychological safety. You know, there are no experts, as you and I often talk about. You have that great phrase you use that people just have opinions. I believe passionately with all the sectors I work in, I don't really think there's probably ever been any experts, and there definitely aren't any experts for what we're dealing with at the moment. What we've got to do is make the best decisions in the positions that we find ourselves in, and that means getting advice from so many different places, from the people who work for you and the people who work with you, and you've got to trust people to do that. And I think this is a time actually to boost trust rather than to break it.
So we've talked a lot there about sort of communication, about trust, and we've also seen examples whereby organisations and leaders have done some good things and have done some bad things in responding to the crisis. So reputation management is going to be critical as we go through this and when we come out of this, because people will judge us on how we perform in these sort of times. Have you any sort of advice or insights around how we can manage our reputations?
Yeah, but I suppose I challenge the question a little bit. Is this not why we do this thing called leadership? Is this not what we signed up for? You know, there's no doubt when the bad times come, it's showtime. And I mean showtime, not like a kind of an American glitzy way, but I do mean we're kind of thrust onto a stage, the lights are on, and without doubt the people are watching. So this is when we're going to really find out about people. I was listening to John Maxwell the other day, and I think some of the things he says is just utterly brilliant. And he says, crisis doesn't make a leader. Crisis reveals a leader. You know, it tells us what that person's got inside them. And I think that's true for a leader. I think it's the same for the organization. So everybody I've been working with, all my clients in all the sectors, I've been saying, look, you're on the stage now, personally, as a leader within your organization, think about your reputational capital all the time. But of course, that's what good leadership is. Yes, we signed up for this, but leadership is about what we do with people and how we influence people. And of course, we've got a lot of opportunity at the moment to do some really good things out there. So let's get on that stage and let's do what we're supposed to be doing, which is lead.
And you mentioned in the introduction about your time in the education sector. You're no stranger to leadership crises yourself. A lot of my members and viewers to this cast will probably recognise you from the Channel 4 programme Educating Manchester. You went through a very difficult time there. Could you share with us how you manage your own personal well-being, or how you manage it in those difficult times?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard dealing with a crisis. And when I had that crisis, it was a personal crisis, because I was going, what is going on here? I've worked at a school for 14 years and given my best. And yes, we've made mistakes, but they're not that big for me to be in this position. And it was a professional crisis as well. I think there's lots of things I could talk about. We'd take the whole conversation up with that. But I use a model that I call the BEST model that really helps me. And it's an acronym. I'll do it really quickly for you. The B stands for breathing. You know, you've got to breathe. Now, you might be looking at me, Ian, going, you've not been up all night thinking of that one, Drew. You've got to breathe to kind of exist. But I mean mindful breathing, actually taking some time out just to capture yourself, just to get into some mindfulness. I do that every single day. And nasal breathing is the big thing we're looking at in sport at the moment. The E is about eating right. You know, obviously with my sports background, which is the area I've worked in longest, you've got to fuel yourself if you're going to be an athlete. But business leaders need to fuel themselves too. And you've got to fuel yourself when you're going through a time of challenge. Even like now, you know, you might not have time to eat. Make yourself eat. You're going to need the energy. The S stands for sleep. I mean, goodness me, we know the importance of sleep. We know we need to get the 8 hours. There's more research coming out. Great book on this, Why We Sleep, by Matthew Walker. The power of sleep for rejuvenation and for thinking and for performance is huge. And the T in it is about training. You know, we know the benefits of exercise when you're having any taxing time in your life. What it does for stress is incredible. But I'd also talk about the T being training of the mind as well. Learning every day. I've done that for 15 years. I've not had a day off training for 15 years, which I'm sure some viewers will be looking at this going, if you trained every day for 15 years, you should look a lot better than that. But that's the model I've used. Breathing, consciously breathing every day, taking some time out for mindfulness, eat right, look after yourself, sleep right, train your body and your mind every day.
So at some point, this crisis, as we know it now, we're moving out of survival mode. We'll move into what I'm calling sort of the reboot mode. And as we've already talked about, we're not going to go back to business as usual. The businesses won't be the same. And this gives us an opportunity to rethink how we want to work, how we want our businesses to run, and how we want to engage with our people. So what advice would you have for leaders and organizations seeking this opportunity to rethink or reestablish themselves, either personally or from a business perspective?
Mr. Wright, I love that reboot idea. I'm going to nick it. I'll probably put a tweet out about it, but I'll always reference you. I think it's brilliant. There is going to be a reboot. I mean, what I know about crisis that I've been through and crisis that I've studied, because there have been a lot of crises. I mean, we're all going, we've not seen a crisis like this, not quite like this, but in the last 20 years, like we've had bird flu and SARS and global financial crash, 9/11, Manchester Arena attack, Iraq war. There's so many crises we have been through. And what we do know is that things don't return back to normal. And I suppose as leaders, we've got to use that as an opportunity to redevelop it. I mean, you and I both work in the leadership world. I say this, everybody I work with says this, I don't spend enough time at home. Well, there's an opportunity for us to be doing that very thing now. So of course, there needs to be learning that comes from it, and there's always opportunity within crisis. What I do think, though, is, and this is a point I'm talking to everyone out about at the moment, is get your engagement strategy right at the moment, because I think that if we're not engaging the disengaged, potentially furloughed staff or staff who aren't in the office enough, and there's loads of ways to do that. I've heard of Zoom parties and Zoom yoga and whatever people are coming out with, pub quizzes. It's brilliant. More of it, do it, keep people engaged. Because if we're not careful, we're going to get what I refer to as a clash of cultures. We're going to have a group of people that were working through the crisis, and if we've played, or been through something challenging with a group of people, that really galvanizes them. But we might have a group of people coming back to our workplaces who've been on the touchline, who've been observers to the crisis, and therefore there could be a clash of two cultures. And I just think we have to be mindful about that. We can do some engagement stuff now, but I think further down the line, we really need to be thinking about how do we re-engage the people who've been potentially disengaged for a series of weeks or months, depending.
So final question, and we try and do this with all the leaders that we interview. Could you sort of drawn upon your sort of personal experience or career, what one piece of advice or thought or reflection could you offer to viewers for them to take away from our discussion?
One piece of advice, just one.
One.
Can I not have two?
Two if you're quick.
Two, I'll be really quick. Okay, first one is, good and bad times, just hold your nerve. We talk about holding your nerve, right? We say things like steady in the ranks, total calm under pressure, keep your head while everyone around you is losing theirs, but really hold your nerve. How I think you do that is I think you've got to be humble and just go like, I haven't got all the answers, and you know what, that's okay. I think you've got to be honest, as Jim Collins said, confront the brutal facts, but you've got to, as a leader, bring hope. When there's hope on the horizon, there's power in the present. So I think holding your nerve, and I think that's how we do that. The final thing I've got to talk about, though, is humour. You and I have exchanged some text messages, not just during this period, because, you are very funny. I don't mean looking, I mean in kind of your character, but you're a very amusing person, and we have great banter. And I think that carries people through. I know when I had my crisis, when I had the Daily Mail literally on the lawn at the front of the house, TV cameras on the lawn, it was my older brother who rang me up, and we just ended up laughing. And I think humour is so important during these times. And when I've been through tough times in the past, people like you have been there, there's been important people. And I think being able to have a laugh has been crucial. And again, I've been encouraging people to do that. Don't be kind of, worrying too much if we're having a laugh, but of course doing it in the right way and not really taking it too far or doing it at the wrong time. As the famous saying goes, we can tell a joke that's perfect at a wedding, but you wouldn't tell that joke at a funeral, kind of thing.
And on that note, Drew, thank you so much for sharing those insights with us. Thank you very much for your time, and all the best.
My absolute pleasure, and you keep well and go well, sir.